We usually think of economic disasters as slow and gradual. But what if an entire currency could collapse in months or even days? What if the price doubled overnight? People needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy a single loaf of bread, and life savings became worthless. That's hyperinflation, a silent destroyer of economies, governments, and lives. From Weimar Germany to Venezuela, history has shown how fast things can spiral. But how do countries fight back when their money becomes worth nothing? Let's go. Now, in the early 1920s, post-World War Germany was drowning in debt. The Treaty of Versailles demanded crushing reparations, and instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, the German government turned to the printing press. Now, at first, inflation was manageable, but as they printed more and more money to pay the workers, support the economy, and fund reparation payments, prices began to rise. And then they spiraled. By 1923, hyperinflation had completely taken over. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice a day so they could run to the market before prices changed. Children used stacks of banknotes as building blocks, and bread that once cost a few marks now costs billions. The German mark had become so worthless that people used it as wallpaper, toilet paper, or even fuel for fires. It was the first time in the modern world that a major industrialized nation's currency collapsed almost entirely, and it became the blueprint for future economic disasters. Hyperinflation doesn't usually begin with reckless spending or economic collapse. It usually starts with a government in crisis trying to stay afloat. Now, here are the usual steps. A country is facing a massive challenge, either that be war reparations, foreign sanctions, economic recession, political upheaval, or collapsing exports. And the government can't raise enough revenue through taxes or borrowing, so they turn to the easiest short-term fix: printing money. And at first this seems to work. Salaries get paid, bills are covered, economic activity picks up, politicians promise the people that everything is under control. But there's a problem. If you increase the money supply without increasing the number of goods and services in the economy, all you do is dilute the value of the money already in circulation. So, prices begin to rise, slowly at first, but then faster. Now businesses raise prices because their costs are rising. Workers demand higher wages to keep up, and the government in response prints even more money to keep up with these demands. Now this feedback loop is called the wage price spiral, and once it starts, it's hard to stop. Even worse is the psychological shift. People no longer trust their currency to hold value from one day to the next, so they spend it as fast as possible, a behavior economists call the velocity of money. The faster people spend, the faster prices rise, and the more pressure that there is to print even more money. This loss of confidence is the true tipping point. Once people start measuring their prices in foreign currency or commodities like gold or fuel, your nation's currency is no longer money. It's just paper. And governments often make things worse. They blame foreign conspiracies, speculators, or hoarders. They try price controls, force wage freezes, or threats, or even arrests. But without addressing the root problem, which is too much money chasing too few goods, nothing works. And eventually inflation becomes hyperinflation, and the economy enters freefall. When hyperinflation hits, it hits everyone. But it hits the poor and middle class the hardest, because prices don't just rise, they explode. 1 week a loaf of bread costs maybe $2. The next it's 10, and a few days later it's 50. Savings vanish because money loses value faster than you can spend it. People stop using banks. Paychecks are collected and spent the same day, often on necessities like food or fuel because prices go up again tomorrow. Bartering returns. People trade eggs for bread, shoes for soap, and labor for food because currency becomes too unstable to trust. Shops don't bother marking individual prices anymore. They just adjust everything with chalk on a board outside. Businesses can't plan. Contracts become meaningless, and retirees on fixed incomes become destitute. And public services collapse because tax revenue collected today isn't worth anything by the time it's spent. The government loses legitimacy. People turn to black markets, foreign currencies, or commodities to survive. And then social unrest follows. Protests, strikes, scapegoats, and even violence. And psychologically, hyperinflation leaves deep scars. People who often live through hyperinflation never trust banks or paper money again. They hoard goods, they convert their paychecks into hard assets, and they become skeptical of government promises. And after living through all of that, it's hard to blame them. Stopping hyperinflation isn't easy, and by the time governments usually want to stop it, the damage is already done, and it's usually very severe. Step 1 is brutal honesty. Hyperinflation is not going to be solved by printing more money or saying it's under control. You have to admit fault and improve confidence in the currency, often by replacing it. In Weimar Germany, the solution came with the new currency, the Rentenmark. It was backed by land and industrial assets, not gold. And more importantly, the government stopped printing recklessly and brought spending under control. And within months, prices stabilized. That's the second step. Tighten monetary policy. Interest rates go up, printing presses stop, and government budgets are slashed. This causes short-term pain, but it's the only way to regain trust in the currency. Sometimes countries adopt a foreign currency, like the US dollar or euro. In Zimbabwe, they did this in 2009, abandoning their own dollar after inflation hit 79.6 billion%. Prices stabilized almost immediately, but the cost of monetary independence. Over time, international help is also needed. Institutions like the IMF step in with loans and technical support, but they usually require strict austerity measures in return. That can mean mass layoffs, reducing public services, and economic hardship. Lastly, restoring production is critical. You can't just stabilize money, you have to rebuild the economy. That means fixing supply chains, restoring exports, and rebuilding public trust in institutions. Because at the end of the day, a currency's value doesn't come from paper. It comes from confidence, and that's the hardest thing to repair. The best way to stop hyperinflation is never letting it begin in the first place, and that begins with responsible monetary policy. Yes, you may be in a crisis, and it may be very tempting to print more money, but if you're not making more goods as well, you're just going to lead to inflation. And if people stop believing in the currency as well, that inflation you already have is going to go through the roof. Transparent, independent central banks are key, and when politicians control the money supply, it's easy to abuse. Strong fiscal policy is also just as important. Running large deficits year after year, especially in weak economies, sets the stage for collapse. Borrowing sometimes is necessary, I understand, but if debts become unpayable and investors stop lending, printing money becomes the last resort. In Zimbabwe, land reforms and political instability destroy the agricultural output. The government printed money to pay its workers, but with few goods and no foreign investment, inflation exploded. Now, once inflation expectations are out of control, it's nearly impossible to bring them back without drastic action. That's why education and public trust matters. If people understand what causes inflation and believe leaders won't let it happen, confidence stays intact. In short, preventing hyperinflation means combining discipline, transparency, and trust. Because when governments abandon those principles, history doesn't just rhyme, it repeats. It's easy to laugh at stories of trillion-dollar banknotes or people burning money to stay warm. But for people actually living through hyperinflation, it's a tragedy that the money that they earned after years and years of hard work became worthless in a matter of days, weeks, or months. So the next time you hear someone casually say, "It's just printing money," well, remember what happens when money itself breaks. And with that, I'm Evan, and thanks for watching. If you liked what you just saw, then click on the video here. Also, if you haven't, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future videos.